It was supposed to be just another evening. Nothing extraordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. I had been out running some errands, my mind preoccupied with a million little things, when fate decided to place me at the right place, at the right time. Or maybe it was the wrong place. I still don't know. But what I do know is that I'll never forget what happened next. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel heavier. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the faint hum of traffic echoed around me. I wasn't in a rush. No one ever expects that life is about to throw something unimaginable their way. And then it happened. At first, it was just a blur in the corner of my eye. A dark-colored SUV speeding a little too fast down the slick road. The tires screeched against the pavement, and for a moment, my heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I turned my head just in time to see the SUV veer slightly to the right. The driver was struggling to regain control. It wasn't just reckless driving. Something was wrong. Then, like a scene from a nightmare, everything slowed down. The vehicle swerved violently, tires skidding out of control, and in an instant, it slammed into the guardrail. Metal crunched against metal, the sound so loud that it sent a shiver down my spine. The impact was brutal. The SUV flipped once, twice, then landed on its side, the windshield shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. For a second, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you question if you're still inside reality or trapped in some twisted dream. Then the screaming started. A child's cry cut through the night, high-pitched and panicked. My stomach twisted. There were people inside. A family. I didn't think. I just ran. Earlier that evening, before everything spiraled into chaos, the world felt normal for them. Inside the SUV, laughter filled the space. The kind that only comes from a family lost in the warmth of each other's company. The father, a man in his early 40s, kept one hand on the wheel while glancing at his wife in the passenger seat. She was scrolling through her phone, checking messages, occasionally looking up to smile at the kids in the back. The children, 2 of them, were in their own little world. The older one, a boy around 10, was staring out the window, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the glass as the raindrops slid down. The younger one, a little girl barely 5, was humming a song she had been obsessed with for weeks. She had convinced her brother to sing along, and together they created an off-key duet that made their mother shake her head with amusement. The road stretched ahead of them, dark and slick from the recent drizzle. The father tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, moving to an imaginary beat, his thoughts elsewhere. Work had been stressful, and he was glad to finally be heading home. He barely noticed the car that had been trailing behind him for the last few miles. He didn't pay attention to the faint vibration in the steering column, a subtle sign that something was not quite right. The rain had stopped, but the road was still damp. Streetlights cast long, distorted reflections on the asphalt, making the highway look almost surreal. The mother glanced at the dashboard clock. It was later than she had expected. They should have been home by now. She turned to her husband. "You sure you don't want to stop for a coffee?" "You look tired," she said, concern in her voice. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm fine. Just a little longer." In the back, the boy had stopped singing. He was now staring at the GPS screen in the car, watching the blue line guide them forward. "Dad, this road looks weird," he muttered. The father gave a quick glance at the screen. It's just a shortcut. Don't worry, buddy. The girl yawned, rubbing her eyes. I'm sleepy. Her mother reached back and gently patted her leg. Just a little longer, sweetheart. A slight breeze rustled the trees lining the highway. The father tightened his grip on the wheel, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping into his chest. Something about the road felt off. He chalked it up to exhaustion. Then, without warning, the SUV jerked slightly. Whoa, he muttered, adjusting his grip. The car felt different, less responsive, as if something was pulling against it. His wife sat up straighter. What was that? Before he could answer, the steering wheel suddenly stiffened. A fraction of a second later, the SUV veered slightly to the right. He pulled it back, gripping it tighter. The boy leaned forward. Dad? It's fine, he said quickly, though he wasn't sure if it was. The mother turned in her seat, sensing the shift in the air. The car wasn't moving the way it should. There was an unnatural resistance, like something was dragging them off course. Then came the real warning sign. The dashboard lights flickered. Panic sparked in the father's chest. He pressed the brakes. Nothing. He pressed harder. Still nothing. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. The brakes weren't working. His mind raced. His pulse skyrocketed. His wife's voice was sharp now. What's happening? The brakes. Before he could finish, the car skidded, tires screeching against the wet pavement. The boy grabbed onto his seatbelt, eyes wide. The little girl let out a small, confused sound. The father yanked the wheel, but it was too late. The car was no longer under his control. They were going too fast. And up ahead, the road curved sharply. The moment I reached the wreckage, my heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. The SUV lay on its side, steam hissing from the crumpled hood, the shattered windshield glinting under the dim street lights. The front airbags had deployed, pressing against the driver and passenger seats like lifeless ghosts. Inside, shadows moved, frantic, desperate. I could hear muffled cries, the unmistakable sound of a child sobbing. My stomach clenched. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. I ran to the passenger side, where the shattered glass had formed a dangerous mosaic around the opening. Peering inside, I saw them. The father was barely conscious, his head slumped forward, a streak of blood running down his temple. His wife was awake, though. Her wide, terrified eyes met mine. She was trying to twist around, to reach for something in the back. That's when I saw the kids. The boy was shaking his father's shoulder, his small hands clutching at the man's jacket. Dad, wake up. Please wake up. The little girl was strapped into her car seat, her tiny face streaked with tears. She was crying, gasping for air between sobs, completely frozen in fear. I didn't hesitate. I'm going to get you out, I shouted through the broken window. The mother coughed, nodding frantically. Please, my kids, get my kids out first. The SUV creaked ominously as I pulled myself up to get a better angle. The way it was positioned, any sudden movement might cause it to shift further. I needed to work fast. I reached in and grabbed the boy's arm. I need you to listen to me. I'm going to pull you out first, all right? He sniffled but nodded, his face pale. His seatbelt was still latched. My fingers fumbled against the buckle, my breath coming in short bursts. The metal was bent slightly from the impact. Come on, I muttered. Then click. The belt released, and the boy nearly tumbled forward. I caught him, pulling him through the broken window. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he turned back, his voice rising. "My sister! You have to get my sister!" I was already moving. The little girl's seatbelt was even trickier. Her car seat had been thrown at an awkward angle, making it harder to reach. She was hiccuping between sobs, her tiny fingers digging into the fabric of her seat. "It's okay, sweetheart," I told her, forcing my voice to be calm. "I'm going to take you to your brother, all right?" Her wide eyes met mine, full of fear. She didn't respond, just clung tighter to her car seat. I gritted my teeth, reaching around to find the latch. The SUV groaned again, shifting slightly. My heart leaped into my throat. There wasn't much time. Finally, the buckle gave way, and I gently pried her free. She whimpered as I lifted her, her tiny arms wrapping tightly around my neck. I pulled back through the window as carefully as I could, shielding her from the jagged edges. The moment we were out, her brother ran forward, wrapping his arms around her. The mother was still trapped inside. Her seatbelt was jammed, and the impact had wedged her legs into the cramped space beneath the dashboard. "I can't move," she gasped, wincing as she tried to shift. "My husband, he's not waking up." I climbed onto the side of the car, trying to get a better angle. "Stay with me," I told her. "We'll get you both out." Just then, the faint sound of sirens filled the air. Help was coming, but we weren't safe yet. I reached in, hands trembling slightly as I worked at the seatbelt. The metal refused to budge. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to stay focused. I had to get her out. Then, the worst sound yet. A deep creaking noise from the undercarriage. The SUV shifted again, tilting dangerously. It was going to fall. I grabbed her face gently, making her look at me. "You have to trust me. When I say go, you push as hard as you can. I'll pull you out." She gave a shaky nod. I braced myself, gripping her arms tightly. "Now!" she screamed as she pushed, and I yanked with everything I had. For a horrifying second, she didn't move. Then, with one final pull, she was free. We tumbled backward onto the pavement, just as the SUV let out a final groan and collapsed fully onto its side. She gasped for air, clutching her chest. I barely had time to register the relief in her eyes before she scrambled toward her children, wrapping them in a trembling embrace. The father was still inside. The sirens were closer now. I turned back, swallowing hard. The wreckage was worse than I had realized. His side of the car was crushed inward. The door twisted beyond recognition. There was no way to reach him from there. I moved back to the shattered windshield, bracing myself against the frame. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. The firefighters were pulling up now. I could see them rushing forward, equipment in hand. One of them, a tall guy with a sharp, focused expression, met my eyes. "There's still someone inside," I called out. He nodded, barking orders to his team. I stepped back, letting them take over, my hands shaking as the adrenaline started to fade. The mother was sobbing into her children's hair, whispering words of comfort between deep, shuddering breaths. I looked at the wreckage, my chest tightening. The father had to make it. The flashing red and blue lights painted the wet pavement in shifting colors as the emergency team worked quickly. I stood back, my breathing still unsteady, watching as they carefully extracted the father from the wreckage. The firefighters had to cut through the mangled metal to reach him. Every second felt like an eternity. The mother clutched her children tightly, her hands trembling as she whispered prayers under her breath. The little girl had stopped crying, but was still holding onto her mother's shirt with a grip so tight that her tiny knuckles had turned white. The boy, though shaken, kept his eyes locked on the wreckage, his face full of fear. Then movement. A collective breath was held as the emergency responders finally pulled the father free. He was unconscious but breathing. They laid him carefully on a stretcher, an oxygen mask pressed to his face, his pulse checked by the paramedics. The mother let out a sob, half relief, half exhaustion, as she buried her face into her son's shoulder. I exhaled, my own hands still trembling. The rush of adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling heavy, drained. One of the firefighters approached me, his expression a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You were the first one on the scene?" he asked. I nodded, still catching my breath. I just did what anyone would do. The firefighter gave a small, knowing smile. Not everyone runs toward danger like that. I glanced back at the family. The mother was now talking to one of the paramedics, nodding as they checked her for injuries. The kids, still shaken, huddled close together. The father, though still unconscious, was stable. The realization settled over me. They were safe. That was all that mattered. A few minutes later, a police officer approached with a notepad in hand. "We're going to need a statement from you," he said, but his tone was warm, not demanding. "You saved their lives tonight." I shook my head. "I just helped." He chuckled, jotting something down. "I think they'd say otherwise." As if to prove his point, the mother suddenly broke away from the paramedics and walked toward me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around me in a tight, desperate hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you so much. I don't even have words." I patted her back gently. "You don't need to say anything. I'm just glad you're all okay." She pulled back, her face filled with gratitude. "If you hadn't been there—" Her voice trailed off, but I understood. The boy stepped forward then, staring up at me with wide eyes. "You're really Big Shaq," he said, almost in disbelief. I grinned, kneeling down slightly to meet his gaze. "That's what they call me." His lips trembled before a small, tired smile broke through. "You're a real hero." I ruffled his hair. "Nah, just someone who couldn't stand by and do nothing." By now, news crews had started arriving, their cameras flashing as they recorded the aftermath. I wasn't looking for attention, but I knew this moment would spread. People loved stories of hope, of ordinary moments turned extraordinary. And tonight, that's exactly what had happened. The paramedics confirmed that the father would be all right. A concussion, a few broken ribs, but nothing life-threatening. The relief that washed over the mother's face was indescribable. She kept glancing at me, as if she still couldn't believe this was real. Before they were taken away in the ambulance, she reached out once more. "Please, if there's anything we can do,